On a freezing night, an elderly man offers his coat and kindness to a young homeless man trembling in the cold. But what begins as an act of compassion takes an unexpected turn when the young man disappears with a precious watch, hiding a deep secret about the elderly man's long-lost daughter. Days later, a chance encounter leads to a life-changing proposal that ties their fates together. What drove the young man to take the watch? And why does the elderly man still choose to help? Stay until the end to discover how this twisted connection unfolds. Hamburg was shrouded in a damp fog on that cold winter night. The biting winds that swept through the deserted streets kept most people indoors. Thomas, however, stood there, waiting at a weathered bus shelter. With his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn overcoat, he tried to ignore the cold that felt like it was piercing through to his bones. He watched the street illuminated by flickering yellow lights, giving the scene an air of melancholy. The sound of footsteps was muffled by the distant echo of tires gliding over wet pavement. Thomas glanced at his wristwatch, impatient. The next bus wouldn't arrive for at least 15 minutes. As he waited, he noticed a hunched figure on the bench of the shelter a few meters away. It was a young man, perhaps just over 20, dressed in clothes too fine to withstand the chill. His shoulders were slumped, and his trembling hands revealed that he was struggling against the cold without much success. Beside him, a worn backpack, probably containing all his belongings. Thomas tried to look away, but something about the young man made it impossible to ignore him. He knew what it was like to be in that situation, even though he had managed to overcome his own demons decades ago. After a long sigh, he approached hesitantly. "It's too cold to be sitting like that," Thomas said, his voice hoarse. The young man looked up, revealing a gaunt, weary face. His deep, suspicious eyes met Thomas's without a word. Thomas hesitated, running his hand over his coat as if searching for courage. "Here, take this," he offered, pulling off his own coat and extending it to the young man. "I don't need charity," the young man replied, his voice firm but laced with a bitterness that Thomas recognized immediately. "It's not charity," Thomas insisted, keeping the coat extended. "It's just a coat. It won't change my life, but it could make a difference in yours tonight." The young man hesitated, his eyes flickering between the coat and Thomas's face. Finally, he shook his head. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, the distrust still evident. Thomas gave a faint smile, though his eyes remained serious. "Because I've been there," he replied, sitting down on the bench beside him, "and because someone did this for me once." Silence hung between them for a moment. The young man seemed to be assessing the sincerity in Thomas's voice. Finally, he took the coat, albeit with visible reluctance. "Thanks, I guess," he murmured. Thomas looked up at the dark sky before asking, "What's your name?" "Lucas," the young man replied. "And yours?" "Thomas." Another silence followed, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if both were trying to decipher each other's presence. Thomas finally broke the silence again. "Lucas, you can't keep living like this. It's too cold. Where are you staying?" Lucas shrugged. "Wherever I can. Here today, somewhere else tomorrow, it doesn't matter." Thomas frowned. There was something about this young man that made him want to persist, even knowing he might be rejected. "Listen," he began carefully. "I live nearby. It's nothing luxurious, but there's a couch and warm food. You can spend the night there. Tomorrow morning, you decide what you want to do." Lucas lifted his head, surprised. He studied Thomas for a few seconds, clearly skeptical. "Why are you doing this?" he repeated, this time with a softer tone. Thomas took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Because Sometimes an outstretched hand can change someone's life, and because someone did that for me when I needed it." Lucas looked as if he was about to refuse, but then his shoulders slumped, as if he had given up fighting against something invisible. "All right," he said, rising slowly, "but just for one night." Thomas nodded, satisfied, and began walking toward his home, with Lucas following a few steps behind. The path was silent, interrupted only by the sound of their footsteps and the wind whistling through the streets. When they arrived at Thomas's modest apartment, Lucas paused at the entrance, as if reconsidering his decision. Thomas noticed the hesitation and opened the door, holding it for Lucas without saying anything. Lucas stepped in with cautious steps. The small apartment was simple but inviting. A worn leather sofa dominated the living room, and the kitchen, visible from the other side, had utensils arranged almost obsessively. There was a warmth in the space, a stark contrast to the cold world outside. "Make yourself comfortable," Thomas said, gesturing to the sofa. He walked to the kitchen and began preparing something warm. "Do you like soup?" "Anything is fine," Lucas replied, throwing his backpack on the floor and sitting down slowly. As the soup heated, Thomas returned to the living room and pulled a chair, sitting down across from Lucas. "So, Lucas, how did you end up here?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Lucas shook his head. "It's a long story, and I don't like to tell my life story to strangers." Thomas nodded. "Fair enough, but know that if you need to talk, I'm here to listen." Lucas looked away, clearly uncomfortable. Thomas realized it was better not to press. He got up and returned to the kitchen, serving 2 bowls of hot soup. When he came back to the living room, he handed a bowl to Lucas, who accepted it with a murmured thanks. They ate in silence. The sound of spoons against bowls filled the space. After finishing, Lucas leaned back on the sofa, appearing relaxed for the first time. "Why did you help me?" he asked again, this time almost as a whisper. Thomas looked at him, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. "Because many years ago, I hit rock bottom, and someone I barely knew reached out and helped me. I wouldn't have survived without that person. I guess I'm just returning the favor." Lucas seemed to process these words. He opened his mouth to say something, but then hesitated. Instead, he closed his eyes, clearly exhausted. Thomas grabbed a blanket and draped it over him. "Sleep. Tomorrow you can decide what to do." He turned off the lights and went to his bedroom. That night marked the beginning of something neither of them could foresee. The gray morning light began to seep into Thomas's small apartment, filtering through the worn curtains. Silence still reigned in the space, except for a faint snore coming from the sofa. Lucas was sleeping soundly, wrapped in the blanket Thomas had given him the night before. It was the first time in weeks that he had slept under a roof, secure in the knowledge that he wouldn't be woken by police or other homeless people looking for trouble. Thomas was already awake. He slowly stirred a cup of coffee, gazing at the urban landscape through the window. The previous night had brought back memories he would rather forget, but something about Lucas made him want to help, even without knowing if the young man was willing to accept it. After a few minutes, Lucas began to stir on the sofa. He opened his eyes slowly, squinting against the morning light. "Good morning," Thomas said, turning to him. "Coffee?" Lucas sat up, still groggy. He rubbed his eyes before responding. "Sure, thanks." Thomas brought over a steaming cup and placed it on the table in front of Lucas. He sat in a nearby chair, watching the young man drink in silence. "Did you sleep well?" Thomas asked, breaking the silence. "Better than I have in a long time," Lucas admitted, looking at the cup in his hands. Thomas nodded, satisfied. After a moment, he got up and went to a closet in the hallway, pulling out some old but clean clothes. "Here, I thought you might need some fresh clothes. They're not exactly fashionable, but they're in good shape." Lucas looked at the bundle in surprise but didn't protest. He took the clothes and murmured a thank you before getting up and heading to the bathroom. When he returned, wearing a light blue sweater and wool pants, he looked like a different person. Thomas noticed that beneath all the dirt and despair, there was a young man who could have any future, if only he had help. "You look better in those than I do," Thomas said with a smile. Lucas responded with a shy grin, but quickly looked away. Silence fell again, and Thomas realized it was time to speak. He picked up his coffee cup, took a sip, and began, "Lucas, you asked me last night why I help. I think you deserve a more complete answer." Lucas raised his eyes, curious but still cautious. "Many years ago, I was where you are now. Homeless, hopeless. I lost everything because of an addiction to gambling. Casinos, bets, you name it. If it involved cards or roulette, I was there." Lucas frowned. "Gambling? Seriously? That seems kind of, I don't know, superficial?" Thomas let out a bitter laugh. "That's what it seems until you lose your home, your job, and your family. My wife left me, and my daughter." He paused, swallowing hard. "Well, she was 8 when she left my life, and never came back." Lucas fell silent, absorbing the words. Thomas continued, "I was at rock bottom when a man, a complete stranger, saw me sleeping on the street and offered me help. He had no obligation to do anything for me, but he gave me a roof over my head, a meal, and a little hope. It was enough for me to start rebuilding my life." Thomas looked at Lucas seriously. "That's why I reached out to you, because someone did that for me when I needed it most." Lucas seemed like he wanted to say something but hesitated. He finally let out a sigh. "I never knew my dad," he began, his voice low. "And my mum died when I was 8. Car accident. After that, I went from orphanage to orphanage. When I turned 18, they packed my things in a bag and said, 'Good luck.' Guess what? I didn't have luck." Thomas nodded slowly, recognizing the pain in Lucas's words. "And you? How did you end up here on the streets?" Thomas asked carefully. Lucas shrugged. "A bit of everything. I couldn't keep a job, made some bad choices, and, well, drugs didn't help. They're like an escape, you know, when life gets unbearable." Thomas didn't respond immediately. He knew that every word needed to be chosen carefully. "It's not easy to escape that cycle, Lucas, but it's possible, and you're young. You have your whole life ahead of you if you decide to change." Lucas laughed, but without humor. "And you think just a few pretty words will change anything? It's not that simple." "I know it's not simple," Thomas replied firmly, "but it's a start." The conversation faded, and Thomas stood up to collect the empty cups. As he was in the kitchen, Lucas looked around the apartment. It was small but cozy, with a personal touch in every corner. Old photos of Thomas and a girl, likely his daughter, were framed on the shelf. But it was something on the side table that caught his attention. An antique pocket watch, polished and clearly valuable. Lucas stared at the watch for a few seconds before looking away. Thomas returned to the living room and noticed the thoughtful expression on the young man's face. "Is something wrong?" he asked. "No, nothing," Lucas replied quickly. Thomas didn't press further. Instead, he sat on the sofa next to Lucas. "Listen, you can stay here for a few more nights if you want. We can think of something together. A plan." Lucas seemed about to refuse, but paused. He nodded slightly. "Maybe. I'll think about it." Thomas smiled and gave Lucas a light pat on the shoulder before standing up. "I'm going to take a nap. It's still early and I'm tired. Make yourself at home." Lucas watched Thomas go to his room and close the door. The apartment fell silent once again. Lucas sat there for a while, reflecting on everything Thomas had said. He knew the man wanted to help him, but a voice inside his head insisted this was temporary, that he couldn't trust anyone. Lucas looked at the pocket watch again. He knew it could be worth some money, enough to buy a few meals or maybe drugs. He struggled against the impulse for a few minutes, but in the end, survival instinct won out. With silent steps, Lucas took the watch, slipped it into his pocket, and opened the front door. He glanced back at the apartment one last time before stepping out into the cold dawn. Thomas, in the bedroom, heard nothing. Before we dive into the next chapter, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave a comment about your thoughts so far. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming your way. Now let's continue with the story. The sky over Hamburg was grey, threatening rain. Thomas walked down the busy street with his overcoat buttoned up to his neck, holding a bag of groceries. It was a typical morning, but his mind was elsewhere. Since Lucas's escape a few weeks ago, he found himself thinking about the young man more than he would like to admit. It wasn't just the theft of the watch, although that had hurt him deeply. It was the feeling that he could have done more, that perhaps he had failed to convey the trust Lucas needed. As he walked along the crowded sidewalks, something caught his attention. At the entrance of a closed shop, among cardboard boxes and dirty blankets, he spotted a familiar figure. Lucas was huddled in the corner, his hands covering his face as if he wished to disappear from the world. Thomas paused, observing him for a moment. He could simply walk past and pretend he hadn't seen him. After all, Lucas had betrayed him. But that thought lasted only a second. He took a deep breath and crossed the street, approaching the young man. "Lucas!" he called, keeping his voice low to avoid startling him. Lucas slowly lifted his head, his eyes wide with surprise. He looked even thinner and more worn out than the last time Thomas had seen him. For a moment, the young man said nothing, just stared at him, as if expecting to be reprimanded or worse, ignored. "Hi," Lucas murmured hesitantly. "Are you hungry?" Thomas asked directly, avoiding any mention of the watch or the theft. Lucas blinked, clearly confused by the unexpected approach. He opened his mouth to say something, but ended up just nodding. "Come on," Thomas said, extending his hand to help him up. Lucas looked at the hand, suspicious, but accepted it. His movements were slow and awkward, revealing his exhaustion. The two walked in silence to a small restaurant on the corner. The place was simple but clean, with wooden tables and the comforting aroma of fresh food. They sat at a table in the back, away from the noise of the street. Thomas ordered 2 plates of the daily special, potato soup and fresh bread. As they waited, Lucas fiddled with the silverware, avoiding Thomas's gaze. He seemed on the verge of saying something, but held back. "You don't need to say anything right now," Thomas said, trying to ease the tension. "Let's eat first." Lucas nodded silently. When the food arrived, he began to eat quickly, like someone who hadn't had a decent meal in days. Thomas, on the other hand, ate slowly, watching him. Lucas looked vulnerable, almost childlike, which only reinforced Thomas's decision not to give up on him. Once Lucas finished his plate, he leaned back in his chair, sighing. "Thank you," he said, not looking at Thomas. "You're welcome," Thomas replied. "But now I need to ask, why did you run away?" Lucas hesitated, but finally raised his eyes. He started, but then stopped as if the words were stuck in his throat. "I took the watch. I sold it. I needed the money." Thomas nodded slowly, as if he already knew the answer. He didn't seem angry, which surprised Lucas. "Was it for drugs?" Thomas asked, his voice calm yet direct. Lucas lowered his head, ashamed. "Yes, he admitted, struggling. Thomas took a deep breath, trying to contain the pain he felt. That watch wasn't just an object. It was a symbol, a piece of his past that he cherished. But he knew that confronting Lucas with anger wouldn't help at all. "That watch," he began, choosing his words carefully. "It was a gift from my daughter. She gave it to me on my birthday shortly before I lost everything. It's the only thing of hers that I still have." Lucas shut his eyes, as if he wanted to disappear. He seemed smaller in the chair, almost invisible. "I didn't know," he said, his voice barely audible. I was desperate." Thomas nodded again, his eyes fixed on Lucas's. "I know you were," he replied, his tone unexpectedly gentle. "And that's why I'm not going to give up on you." Lucas looked up, clearly surprised. "You're not angry?" he asked, incredulous. "I'm sad, Lucas. Sad because you thought you couldn't trust me. But I'm not angry. I've been through similar things. I know what it's like when hopelessness takes over." Lucas didn't respond immediately. He seemed to be processing the words, struggling against the guilt growing within him. "I wish I could return the watch," he murmured. "But I can't. The money's gone and—" Thomas placed his hand on the table, interrupting him. "Don't worry about the watch right now. It's important, but you are more important. What matters now is what you're going to do from here on out." Lucas fell silent, his eyes misting over. He looked away to avoid letting Thomas see the tears. "I don't know," he said, his voice faltering. "I don't know how to change. I don't even know where to start." Thomas leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. "Then start small, one step at a time. Today you had a decent meal and talked to me. That's a start." Lucas looked at Thomas as if searching for any hint that he wasn't being serious. But all he found was sincerity. "Do you really believe I can change?" Lucas asked, almost as a challenge. Thomas smiled, but his gaze was firm. "Yes, I believe, but you need to believe too." Silence fell between the two again. But this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if something invisible was forming between them. A bridge, perhaps, or a thread of hope. Finally, Lucas spoke. "I have nothing left to lose, so maybe I can try." Thomas smiled, satisfied, and nodded. "That's all I ask, one day at a time." The two finished their meal in silence, but the atmosphere was different. As they left the restaurant, the sky began to clear, and the threatening rain seemed to have changed its mind. As they walked through the streets, Thomas felt that, for the first time, Lucas was willing to listen, and that was a significant step forward. He knew there would still be challenges ahead, but in that moment, there was a small glimmer of hope. And for Thomas, that was more than enough to keep trying. The following morning dawned cold, but with a clear sky. Thomas and Lucas were in Thomas's small apartment. The atmosphere was still laden with caution, but something in the conversation from the previous day had shifted their dynamic. Lucas seemed less distrustful, although he still maintained an air of skepticism. Thomas, on the other hand, was determined to take more concrete steps to help the young man. As Lucas finished eating a piece of bread with butter, Thomas sat down across from him, holding a cup of tea. "Lucas, I've been thinking," he began, carefully choosing his words. "I know things are tough for you right now, and I understand that getting off the streets and leaving certain habits behind isn't something that happens overnight." Lucas looked up but said nothing. He was waiting for Thomas to continue. "But maybe we can work on this together," Thomas suggested, his voice calm yet firm. "I need help with something, and in return, I want to help you get out of this situation." Lucas furrowed his brow, clearly intrigued. He set the bread aside and crossed his arms. "Help with what?" he asked, suspicious. Thomas took a deep breath, leaning forward. "I want to find my daughter," he said finally. "It's been over 20 years. I don't know exactly where she is, but I have an idea. She might be in some town in rural Germany. I thought if you helped me find her, I could help you get back on your feet, starting by getting you off the street and supporting you with whatever you need." Lucas blinked, surprised. The proposal was unexpected, and he didn't know how to react. "You want me to help you find your daughter?" he repeated, as if needing to process the words. Thomas nodded. "Exactly. And in the meantime, I promise to help you find a new path. I can't change your past, Lucas, but I can help you build a future." Lucas fell silent, pondering. He knew Thomas was sincere, but he also knew that promises like these were hard to keep. Still, he didn't have much to lose. "Why me?" he finally asked. "You could do this alone or ask someone else for help." Thomas smiled slightly. "Because, for some reason, I feel like you understand what it means to lose someone important. And maybe because I feel like I need help too, even in different ways." Lucas looked away, clearly touched but trying to hide it. "And how do you know I won't abandon you halfway through?" he challenged. Thomas shrugged. "I don't know, but I'm willing to trust you. The decision is yours." Silence hung between them until Lucas finally sighed. "All right, I accept," he said reluctantly, "but I don't promise anything." "That's all I needed to hear," Thomas replied, satisfied. The two spent the rest of the day mapping out a plan. Thomas pulled out a map of Germany from a drawer, spreading it out on the kitchen table. He pointed to a small town in the countryside where he thought his daughter might be. "I heard years ago that she moved somewhere around here," he explained. "I'm not sure if she's still there, but it's a starting point." Lucas looked at the map, not very convinced. "And what if she's not there?" he asked. "Then we move on," Thomas replied. "The idea is to try, even if it's not easy." Lucas nodded, although he still remained skeptical. "And how are we going to travel?" he asked. Thomas smiled. "I have a little money saved up. We can take trains and buses. It won't be luxurious, but it will be enough." As they discussed the details, Thomas noticed that Lucas was starting to get more involved. He asked questions, suggested ideas, and even smiled from time to time. It was slow progress, but it was real. That night, as Lucas sat on the sofa, Thomas pulled up a chair and sat next to him. He held a small notebook in his hands. "Lucas, can I ask you a personal question?" he asked hesitantly. Lucas looked at him, suspicious but nodded. "You mentioned that you lost your parents when you were a child. Was that what led you to the streets?" Lucas hesitated but eventually answered. "That was the beginning. After they died, I went to an orphanage. It wasn't the worst place in the world, but it wasn't exactly a home. When I turned 18, they basically kicked me out. And, well, here I am." Thomas listened intently, without interrupting. When Lucas finished, he placed a comforting hand on the young man's shoulder. "I'm sorry for all of that," he said sincerely. "You didn't deserve to go through this." Lucas shrugged, trying to act indifferent, but it was clear that Thomas's words had touched him. "It's life, isn't it?" he said with a bitter smile. Thomas nodded, but his gaze remained firm. "Maybe, but that doesn't mean you have to accept that it will always be this way." Lucas didn't respond, but something in his expression suggested he was considering Thomas's words. The next day, Thomas and Lucas began preparing for the trip. Thomas packed clothes and supplies into a backpack while Lucas watched, seemingly uncomfortable. "I've never traveled like this before," Lucas admitted. "Neither have I," Thomas replied with a smile. "But there's a first time for everything." Before they left, Thomas took something from a drawer and put it in his coat pocket. It was an old photo of his daughter, taken when she was about 8 years old. He looked at it for a moment before putting it away. "Are you ready?" he asked Lucas. Lucas nodded, adjusting the strap of his backpack. "I think so." As they left the apartment and headed to the train station, Thomas felt a mix of anxiety and hope. He knew the journey would be difficult, both emotionally and physically, but he also knew he was doing the right thing. Lucas, on the other hand, felt torn. Part of him still distrusted Thomas and his intentions, but another part began to admire the man's determination. He didn't know how the journey would end, but for the first time in a long time, he felt that maybe there was something worth fighting for. And so the two set off, united by their pains and hopes, in search of answers and perhaps a new beginning. The train left Hamburg Central Station early in the morning, plunging into the grey, cold landscape of northern Germany. Inside the carriage, Thomas and Lucas sat side by side in silence, the sound of the train rushing over the tracks, filling the space between them. Thomas gazed out the window, lost in thought, while Lucas fiddled with the zipper of his backpack, trying not to seem as out of place as he felt. "Are you okay?" Thomas asked, breaking the silence. Lucas shrugged. "I don't know. I've never done anything like this before." Thomas nodded, understanding. "Neither have I, but there's a first time for everything." The train was heading to Bremen, the first stop on their journey. Thomas believed that there they might find information about the city where his daughter had moved. He knew it would be a long search, but he was determined to seize every opportunity to strengthen his bond with Lucas along the way. When they arrived in Bremen, the city was blanketed in a thin layer of snow. Thomas led the way to a small diner near the station. They ordered 2 coffees and shared a sandwich, trying to stretch the little money they had. As they ate, Thomas noticed that Lucas seemed uncomfortable. The young man was looking around, as if expecting to be thrown out at any moment. Indeed, some curious glances from other customers seemed to reinforce that fear. "Just ignore them," Thomas said quietly. "You don't owe anyone anything." Lucas gave a small smile, but still looked tense. After finishing their meal, they stepped outside to explore the city. Thomas wanted to ask at local shops and community centers for information about the city where his daughter might be. However, many of the responses were vague, and a few suspicious looks made it clear that they were not welcome everywhere. In a convenience store, the clerk looked Lucas up and down, before responding to Thomas's questions with an apathetic tone. When they left the store, Lucas huffed. "I've seen that look before," he said, hands in his pockets. "They think I'm going to steal something." Thomas sighed and placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "That says nothing about you, Lucas. It just shows how some people judge without knowing the full story." Lucas shook his head but didn't respond. While walking through the center of Bremen, something caught Lucas's attention. In the window of a pawn shop, an old but well-kept guitar was on display. He stopped abruptly, his eyes fixed on the instrument. Thomas noticed the interest and stopped beside him. "Do you play?" he asked. Lucas hesitated before answering. "I used to, a long time ago, before everything went wrong." Thomas smiled. "Do you want to take a look?" Lucas seemed to hesitate, but eventually nodded. They entered the shop, where an elderly man greeted them with a smile. Thomas explained that Lucas wanted to try the guitar, and the shop owner handed over the instrument without hesitation. Lucas held the guitar gently, as if it was something precious. He sat down on a nearby bench and began to tune the strings. His hands, though visibly nervous, seemed to remember what to do. When he started to play, Thomas felt a shiver. The melody was simple, yet filled with emotion. The notes echoed through the space, drawing even the shop owner closer to listen. Lucas appeared lost in the music, his eyes closed, as if that moment was an escape from the weight he carried. When he finished, there was a silence in the air, as if no one wanted to break the magic of the moment. The shop owner clapped softly. "You have talent, kid," he said. "How long has it been since you played?" "Years," Lucas replied, placing the guitar back on the stand. His expression was a mix of sadness and nostalgia. Thomas placed his hand on Lucas's shoulder. "You should play more. It seems to do you good." Lucas gave a shy smile but didn't say anything. They left the shop, leaving the guitar behind. However, something had changed. For the first time, Thomas saw a spark in Lucas's eyes that he hadn't seen before. Later that night, the two found a small hostel where they could spend the night. The room was simple, with 2 narrow beds and a window overlooking the street. After settling in, Thomas turned on the lamp and sat on the bed. "Today was an interesting day," he said, looking at Lucas, who was lying on the other bed. "Interesting?" Lucas asked, laughing lightly. "I think you're being polite. We spent the whole day being ignored or judged." Thomas smiled. "Maybe, but you played that guitar, and that for me was an incredible moment." Lucas looked away, uncomfortable with the compliment. "I don't know if it makes a difference. Playing won't change my life." "Maybe not," Thomas replied, "but it could be a start. You have something special, Lucas. Don't let that die." Lucas didn't respond immediately. He stared at the ceiling, lost in thought. "And you?" he finally asked. "Why do you still believe you'll find your daughter after all this time? I mean, 20 years is a long time." Thomas took a deep breath, contemplating his answer. "Because I need to believe," he said finally. "I don't know if I'll find her or if she'll want to see me, but I have to try. Because if I don't, I'll carry that doubt for the rest of my life." Lucas fell silent, pondering Thomas's words. He knew the man was right, but he still wasn't sure if he believed anything in his own life could change. "I guess you're more optimistic than I am," Lucas said finally. Thomas laughed. "Maybe, but sometimes optimism is all we have." The two fell silent again, but this time there was an air of mutual understanding between them. As night fell, each reflected on their life choices and the uncertain path ahead. Despite their doubts and fears, they both knew that together they had a chance to change something, however small that might be, and in that moment, that was enough. The train swayed gently as it crossed snow-covered fields. Thomas was quieter than usual, his eyes fixed on the landscape. Lucas noticed the silence but didn't ask anything. He knew that the next stop would be especially difficult for Thomas, the city where he had grown up and where his life began to unravel. When they disembarked, the cold felt even more intense. Or perhaps it was just the heavy atmosphere of that place. Thomas led the way down the narrow streets, where red brick houses stood like silent witnesses to a story he would prefer to forget. "It's strange to be back here." Thomas finally broke the silence. "I hardly recognize the place." Lucas looked around. To him, the city seemed ordinary, nothing special. But for Thomas, every corner seemed to carry memories he could not avoid. They stopped in front of a modest house with walls worn by time. Thomas stood still, his eyes fixed on the facade. "This is where I grew up," he said, his voice low. "My parents were simple people, but hard-working. My father was a carpenter, and my mother sewed to earn some extra money." Lucas didn't reply. He could feel the emotional weight in Thomas's words. "I remember the nights when my mother would sit on the porch to sew, and the smell of fresh wood in my father's workshop. It was a happy place, for the most part." Thomas paused, as if trying to decide what to say next. "But everything changed when they died. A car accident. I was 19 and suddenly I was alone in the world." Lucas felt a chill. Thomas's story seemed strangely familiar. "That's when I started gambling," Thomas continued. At first, it was just a way to escape the pain. But over time, it became something I couldn't control. Thomas shook his head as if trying to push the memories away. Let's keep going. There's another place I want to show you. They walked to an old building in the city center. The casino's facade was decaying, but it still held an aura of false glamour. Thomas stopped on the sidewalk, staring at the flickering sign. This place, he began hesitantly. This is where everything fell apart. I came here almost every night, trying to win back what I had lost. But, of course, I never did. Lucas looked at the building, trying to imagine a younger Thomas sitting at a poker table or roulette wheel, betting what he didn't have. It was here that I lost my home, Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. My family. Everything. He turned to Lucas, his eyes shining with a mix of sadness and determination. My wife left me after that. She was right. I was a broken man. I couldn't stop. And my daughter... He paused, taking a deep breath. She was 8 when she saw me for the last time. I remember her look. It was as if she already knew I wasn't the father she deserved anymore. Lucas remained silent, feeling the weight of Thomas's words. He knew what it was like to lose everything, but he had never considered the impact his actions could have on others. Did you ever try to stop? Lucas finally asked. Thomas let out a bitter laugh. I tried, but it's not that simple. Addiction is like a black hole. The more you try to escape, the more it sucks you in. Lucas nodded, thinking of his own struggles with drugs. I think I understand. Thomas placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. I know you do. That's why I'm telling you all this. I want you to know it's possible to climb out of that hole. But you have to want it. Lucas looked away, clearly uncomfortable. I don't know if I can, he murmured. Thomas tightened his grip on his shoulder. I thought I couldn't either, but I'm here, and you can be too. That night, they found a cheap little hotel and shared a room. Thomas seemed exhausted, but relieved to have faced his ghosts. Lucas, on the other hand, was restless. He paced back and forth, processing everything he had heard. Finally, he sat on the bed opposite Thomas. You know, when you talk about your daughter, it makes me think of my mother, he said unexpectedly. Thomas looked at him, surprised. I never thought much about how she felt when she was alive. I always thought she was strong enough to handle everything. But listening to you, I wonder, what if she felt like your daughter? Like someone who couldn't do anything to help? Thomas didn't respond immediately. He knew Lucas was grappling with something significant. Lucas, it doesn't help to punish yourself for the past, but you can learn from it. You can decide to do something different in the future. Lucas looked at him, his eyes filled with doubt. What if it's too late? Thomas smiled faintly. It's never too late. I still believe I can find my daughter, and maybe, just maybe, fix some things. You can too. The important thing is to try. Lucas nodded, but didn't say anything more. He lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling, while Thomas turned off the light. In the dark, both reflected on their lives, their choices, and the possibility of a different future. That night, for the first time, Lucas began to imagine what his life could be like if he truly decided to change. And in the silence of the room, a seed of hope was planted. If you're enjoying this journey, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your reflections in the comments below. Your support means everything to the growth of this channel. Let's keep the story moving. The train slowed as it approached the station of the small town, nestled in the heart of rural Germany. Thomas sat by the window, nervously clutching the photograph of his daughter, now worn from the decades. Lucas, sitting beside him, watched in silence, sensing the growing tension in the older man. "Are you ready?" Lucas asked, breaking the silence. Thomas took a deep breath, but didn't respond immediately. He knew that the word ready didn't encompass what he felt. How does one prepare to reconnect with a part of himself that he had let slip away over 20 years ago? "I don't think so," he finally admitted, "but I have no other choice." Lucas nodded. He too wasn't sure how to feel. The idea of helping Thomas confront the past was strangely inspiring, but it also made him reflect on his own mistakes. After a few hours of searching the town, Thomas and Lucas finally arrived at the address they had found. The house was modest, with a small garden covered in dry leaves. Toys were scattered in the yard, suggesting the presence of children. Thomas hesitated on the sidewalk, staring at the door as if it were a portal to an unknown world. "She has children," he said almost in a whisper. I'm a grandfather." Lucas placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Come on, you can do this." Thomas took a deep breath and walked to the door, with Lucas right behind him. He raised his hand, hesitated for a moment, and finally knocked. Seconds felt like hours until the door opened. A woman in her 30s appeared, with features that vaguely resembled those in the photograph Thomas carried. However, her eyes did not express the joy of a reunion. They were cold, almost hostile. "Father," she said, the word coming out more as an accusation than a greeting. Thomas swallowed hard, feeling the weight of all the years of distance between them. "Yes, it's me, Emily," he said, his voice trembling. "May I speak with you?" She crossed her arms, looking him up and down. "I don't know what you want here after so long." Thomas felt her words hit like a blow, but he remained firm. "I want to apologize," he said, looking directly into her eyes. "For everything, for failing as a father, for leaving, and if you give me a chance, I want to make amends for what I can." Emily laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. "Make amends? You think you can just show up after 20 years and fix everything? You weren't there when I needed you. You didn't see how much Mom suffered. And now you want to be part of my life?" Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but found no words. Lucas, who had been silent until then, stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said carefully. "I know this isn't my place, but he came here because he believes you deserve to hear this. And honestly, he's trying. He isn't asking you to forget the past. He just wants a chance to be part of the present." Emily looked at Lucas, surprised by his intervention. She seemed to ponder for a moment before sighing. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said, looking at Thomas, "but if you really want to try, maybe we can talk. One day." Thomas nodded, hope slowly returning to his face. "Thank you. Just the fact that you're willing to talk means a lot to me." Emily didn't respond. Instead, she slowly closed the door, leaving the two of them on the porch. Back at the small hotel where they were staying, Thomas appeared exhausted, but also relieved. He knew that Emily's reaction wasn't ideal, but it was more than he had expected. "What now?" Lucas asked as he flopped onto the bed. "What's the next step?" Thomas thought for a moment before responding. "I think I need to show her that I'm serious. It's not enough to just apologize. I need to do something that demonstrates I want to be part of her life." Lucas fell silent, thinking. After a few minutes, he sat up. "What if we organize a dinner?" he suggested. "Something simple but special. It could be a chance for you to talk without pressure." Thomas raised his eyebrows. "A dinner? Do you think she would accept?" Lucas shrugged. "It doesn't hurt to try. You can invite her and make it clear that she only has to come if she wants. No obligations." Thomas seemed to consider the idea. "Maybe it could work, but I need your help." Lucas laughed. "Of course. After all, that's what I'm here for, right?" The next day, Thomas returned to Amelie's house, this time alone. When she opened the door, she seemed less hostile but still distant. "What is it now?" she asked, crossing her arms. "I just wanted to invite you to dinner," Thomas said quickly. "Nothing complicated. Just a chance to talk in a more relaxed setting. You don't have to accept, but I'd like you to come." Amelie hesitated, clearly torn. Finally, she sighed. "Fine, but only because I want to hear what you have to say. Don't expect more than that." Thomas nodded, relieved. "Thank you. This is already more than I expected."
Okay.
Thomas and Lucas spent the next day preparing for the dinner. They bought simple yet quality ingredients and cooked together in the small hotel kitchen. To Thomas's surprise, Lucas proved to be a good helper, showing an unexpected knack for chopping vegetables and seasoning dishes. "I didn't know you could cook," Thomas commented. Lucas shrugged. "I learned when I was at a shelter. Cooking was one of the few things that made me feel useful." Thomas smiled. "Well, you're good at it." As they prepared the meal, the two discussed what Thomas should say to Amelie. Lucas suggested that he be honest but careful, focusing on what he wanted to build for the future instead of dwelling on the past. That evening, Amelie arrived at the hotel, looking tense but willing. Lucas greeted her at the entrance and led her to the small living room where Thomas was waiting, visibly nervous. The dinner began in silence, with trivial conversations about the town and the weather. Lucas did his best to ease the tension, telling funny stories from his childhood that even made Amelie smile. Finally, Thomas took a deep breath and gathered the courage to address the main issue. "Amelie, I know I can't change the past, but I want to be part of the future. I know I hurt you, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right, if you give me the chance." Amelie looked at him, her eyes misty. "I don't know if I can trust you, Dad. Not after everything." Thomas nodded, understanding her hesitation. "I'm not asking you to trust me now. I'm only asking for the opportunity to prove that I can be better." Lucas, sensing that the moment was delicate, discreetly left the room, giving the two of them space. Amelie finally let out a sigh. "All right, Dad, but I'm going to need time." Thomas smiled, wiping away a tear. "Time is all I need." That night, something changed between father and daughter. It wasn't a complete forgiveness, but a door had been opened. And for Thomas, that was the beginning of something he thought he would never have again. Dinner was in full swing, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Thomas and Amelie sat across from each other at the small wooden table, each trying to find words to fill the uncomfortable silence. Lucas, in the corner of the room, watched the scene, nervously fiddling with the sleeves of his jacket. He could feel the weight of unspoken words, of wounds that still lingered between father and daughter. Thomas took a deep breath, setting his utensils down on his plate. "Amelie, I know it won't be easy for you to trust me again. I understand that. But I want you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to regain at least a little of what we lost." Amelie kept her eyes fixed on her plate, pushing her food around with her fork. "Dad, you say you understand, but do you really understand? Do you know what it was like for me to grow up without you? Knowing that Mum was struggling alone while you—" She paused, as if she didn't want to say the words. "While you were betting everything in a casino?" Thomas swallowed hard, clearly struck by her words. "I know there are no excuses for what I did, Amelie, but I want you to know that I never spent a day without regretting it. I never spent a day without thinking of you." Amelie finally lifted her gaze, her eyes glistening with tears. "It's hard to believe that after so long, Dad. I learned to live without you. I don't know if I can make space for you now." Lucas watched the exchange with growing anxiety. He knew that this moment was crucial, but he also knew that Thomas needed help. And then his eyes landed on the guitar in the corner of the room, borrowed from a neighbor at the hotel, an impromptu idea to pass the time. He slowly got up and picked up the instrument, drawing the attention of both. "Do you mind?" he asked, adjusting the strings. "I have a song I wrote a while back. Maybe it will help." Amelie frowned, surprised, while Thomas looked at Lucas with curiosity. "Go ahead, Lucas," Thomas said, nodding. Lucas sat down in a nearby chair and began to play the first notes. It was a soft melody, yet full of emotion, each chord laden with a sincerity that was hard to ignore. He closed his eyes, letting his fingers move naturally over the strings, as if he were channeling something from the depths of his soul. When he began to sing, his voice was low, almost a whisper, but filled with feeling. "We've lost our way. The words got stuck. But in the silence, there's still hope. A gesture, a song, perhaps forgiveness. We can find our home in the heart." Amelie watched Lucas, as if seeing a part of him she didn't know. The voice and music filled the room, breaking down the invisible barriers that had formed during dinner. Thomas was also still, his eyes fixed on the young man. It was as if the music was giving voice to everything he wanted to say, but didn't know how to express. As Lucas continued, the atmosphere in the room changed. Amelie, who initially seemed skeptical, was now visibly moved. Tears finally streamed down her face, and she placed a hand on her chest, as if the music were reaching something deep within her. When Lucas finished, silence returned to the room. But it was no longer an uncomfortable silence. It was a silence filled with emotion and meaning. Lucas set the guitar aside and looked at Amelie. "I know it's not easy to forgive, Amelie. I struggle to forgive myself every day. But sometimes, all we need to do is take a step in the right direction. Just one step." Amelie looked at Lucas, then at Thomas. Finally, she spoke, her voice choked. "That song, it felt like exactly what I needed to hear. Thank you, Lucas." She turned to Thomas, her eyes still shining with tears. "Dad, I don't know if I can forget everything that happened, but maybe I can try. One step at a time, like Lucas said." Thomas swallowed hard, fighting to hold back his own tears. "That's all I ask, Amelie, thank you. Thank you for giving me this chance." After dinner was over, Amelie stayed for a while longer, talking with Thomas and Lucas. The conversation was still marked by caution, but there was a new openness, a space where reconciliation could blossom. When she finally stood up to leave, Thomas walked her to the door. "Dad," she said, hesitating before continuing, "thank you for coming. It means more than I can express right now." Thomas smiled, a mix of relief and emotion. "Thank you for having me, Amelie. I promise I won't disappoint you this time." She nodded before briefly hugging him. Then she left, leaving Thomas and Lucas alone in the room. Thomas sat at the table, still processing what had happened. He looked at Lucas, who was putting the guitar away in the corner. "Lucas," he began, his voice filled with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you for what you did today. Your music, it was like a miracle." Lucas shrugged, but there was a shy smile on his face. "It was nothing. I just thought it might help." Thomas shook his head. "It was more than that. It was incredible. You have a gift that can't be ignored, Lucas. Not just for playing, but for connecting with people." Lucas looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "I never thought of music that way. It's always been something I did for myself, you know? I never thought it could mean something to someone else." Thomas smiled. "Well, you proved that you were wrong." Lucas felt something different stir within him that night. For the first time in a long while, he began to believe he had something to offer the world. And as he and Thomas talked, they both realized that that night was not just a step in Thomas's journey to win back his daughter. It was also an important step in Lucas's journey to find his own purpose. That night, as Hamburg slept, two souls found a bit of peace, one in forgiveness, the other in music. The sun was beginning to set when Amelie visited Thomas and Lucas at the hotel a few days after the dinner. She seemed more relaxed, though still held a certain reserve. She carried a brochure with the logo of an NGO she managed. The title on the cover read, "Paths to Hope, Rehabilitation and Social Reintegration." "Lucas, I think you might be interested in this," she said, handing the brochure to the young man. Lucas took the paper, reading it attentively. His eyes narrowed when he reached the part describing rehabilitation programs and support for youth in vulnerable situations. "Is this where you work?" he asked. Amelie nodded. "It's more than just where I work. I helped found this NGO 5 years ago. Our focus is to assist young people facing challenges like yours. We have an amazing team, and the rehabilitation program is entirely voluntary. But if you decide to join, I promise we will be by your side throughout the process." Lucas fell silent, his hands tightening around the brochure. He knew he needed help, but admitting it was another story. After a few moments, he finally spoke. "What if I fail?" he asked, his voice heavy with doubt. Amelie sat down beside him, her tone calm yet firm. "Everyone fails at some point. The important thing is to keep trying. No one expects you to be perfect, Lucas, just that you're willing to try." Thomas, who had been watching from his chair, interjected. "Lucas, this is a chance to start over. I know it seems daunting, but you don't have to do this alone. We'll be there for you." Lucas looked at the two of them, feeling for the first time in a long time that he was part of something bigger than his own struggle. He took a deep breath and nodded. "All right, I'll try." 2 days later, Lucas found himself at the headquarters of Amelie's NGO, a simple but welcoming building adorned with colorful murals and messages of hope. Amelie introduced him to some team members, including therapists and counselors, who greeted him with warm smiles. "No one here is going to judge you," Amelie said as they walked down the hallway. "Everyone here has their own battles. The difference is that they've chosen to face them together." Lucas felt a mix of nervousness and hope as he got to know the space. He was led to a meeting room where other program participants were gathered. They all seemed different in their stories, but similar in their desire to change. "Lucas, this is the support group you'll be attending. It's a safe space to share and learn from each other. You don't have to force yourself to speak, but I hope that over time, you'll feel comfortable enough to share your story." Lucas nodded, still unsure if he could do it, but determined to try. As Lucas began his journey in rehabilitation, Thomas and Amelie started to rebuild their relationship. Amelie decided to include Thomas in simple daily activities, like picking up her kids from school or doing grocery shopping. These small interactions were filled with meaning for Thomas, who saw them as a chance to finally connect with his daughter. During one of those occasions, while waiting for Thomas's grandchildren to come out of school, Amelie finally asked, "Why didn't you ever try to reach out before?" Thomas looked at her, feeling the weight of the question. "I thought it was too late. I was so ashamed of everything I did. I was afraid you would hate me." Amelie sighed. "I hated you for a time, but deep down I think I always hoped you would show up. Part of me wanted to believe that you cared." Thomas took Amelie's hand, a small gesture but full of significance. "I always cared, Amelie. I just didn't know how to show it. But now I want to do everything differently. I want to be here for you and your family." Amelie nodded, her eyes welling with tears. "Then let's try, one step at a time." While Thomas and Amelie built a new relationship, Lucas faced the ups and downs of his rehabilitation. The first few days were particularly difficult. The cravings for drugs, combined with guilt and doubt, made him constantly question his decision to join the program. In one of the group sessions, he finally decided to speak up. "I feel like I'm a lost cause," he said, looking down at his hands. "Every time I try to change, I end up back in the same place. It's like I'm stuck." One of the counselors, a man named Eric, responded calmly. "The feeling of being stuck is common, Lucas. But remember, every small step you take forward is a step away from what holds you back. You don't have to do everything at once. Just keep trying." These words stuck with Lucas, and slowly he began to realize that change was a process. He started to participate more actively in the sessions, sharing his stories and listening to others. Thomas made it a point to be present whenever he could. He accompanied Lucas to meetings when allowed and was always available to listen. One night, as Lucas returned from the program, he found Thomas waiting at the hotel with 2 cups of tea. "How was it today?" Thomas asked, handing a cup to Lucas. Lucas gave a small smile, something that was becoming more common. "It was tough, but I think I'm starting to understand that I'm not alone in this." Thomas nodded. "You're not, Lucas. You will never be again." The two talked for hours that night, sharing stories of their struggles and hopes. For Thomas, it was an opportunity to offer something he had never been able to give his daughter: unconditional support. For Lucas, it was proof that he didn't have to face his demons alone. As the weeks went by, Lucas began to show progress. He volunteered to help with activities at the NGO, discovering a passion for working with music as a form of therapy. He started teaching guitar to other young people, using his experience to inspire them. Amelie watched Lucas with admiration. In a conversation with Thomas, she remarked, "Lucas has something special. I think he can really make a difference, not just for himself, but for others." Thomas smiled. "He's starting to realize that too. And honestly, he inspires me. He reminds me that it's never too late to change." One day, after a music performance organized by the NGO, Lucas took the stage and spoke to the audience. "If someone had told me a few months ago that I would be here today, I wouldn't have believed it. But now, I see that sometimes all we need is a chance to start over." The room erupted in applause, with Thomas and Amelie in the front row, visibly moved. For Lucas, it was more than a personal victory. It was proof that he could be someone better. As Thomas embraced Lucas after the performance, he whispered, "I'm proud of you, kid, more than you can imagine." Lucas smiled, feeling for the first time in years that he was on the right path. The auditorium was softly lit, creating a warm and intimate atmosphere. Rows of chairs filled the space, and the audience, composed of friends, family, and supporters of Amelie's NGO, began to settle in. The murmur of conversations mingled with the sound of instruments being tuned on stage. In the center, a chair and a guitar awaited Lucas. Thomas and Amelie sat in the front row, both visibly emotional, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Thomas held Amelie's hand, a gesture that months ago would have seemed unthinkable. Now, they were more than father and daughter. They were companions on a quest for healing and reconciliation. "He's nervous," Amelie whispered, glancing at the empty stage. Thomas smiled. "Who wouldn't be? But he'll do well. Lucas is strong. He's proven that." The idea of the benefit concert had come from Lucas months earlier. After meeting in the rehabilitation program and discovering his talent for using music as a tool for connection, he wanted to give back to those who had supported him. The concert would not only raise funds for the NGO, but also celebrate the journey of everyone on the path to recovery. Lucas had spent weeks rehearsing, revisiting old songs and writing original compositions that told his story. He insisted on doing something special, not just for the NGO, but for Thomas and Amelie. "I owe this to you both," he told Thomas once. "If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here. I want to show you that everything you've done for me was worth it." Thomas, touched by his words, assured him he would be there to support him, as would Amelie, who had helped organize the event. The lights dimmed, and the murmurs in the audience faded. Lucas entered the stage, carrying the guitar with a confident posture, though his eyes revealed a mix of nerves and excitement. He adjusted the microphone and looked out at the audience. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice a bit shaky. "First of all, I want to thank each of you for being here tonight. This concert means more than music to me. It's about hope, second chances, and the people who make it possible." Lucas's eyes met those of Thomas and Amelie, who encouraged him with warm smiles. He took a deep breath and began to play the first notes of a gentle melody. The music filled the auditorium, enveloping the audience in a profound emotional atmosphere. Throughout the evening, Lucas performed several songs, each telling a part of his story. He sang about loss, loneliness, and regret, but also about hope, friendship, and transformation. Each song seemed to resonate with the audience, especially Thomas and Amelie, who saw parts of themselves reflected in the lyrics. "This next song is very special to me," Lucas said before starting a new melody. "It's about finding a home, even when you think you don't deserve one." He began to play a melody that reminded him of the night Thomas invited him to his home for the first time. It was soft and comforting, yet laden with meaning. Thomas closed his eyes, allowing the notes to take him back to that cold night in Hamburg when everything began. As Lucas played, Thomas and Amelie exchanged glances. During the song, it felt as if all the unspoken words between them were being expressed in another way. Amelie held Thomas's hand more firmly and whispered, "I understand now. You never gave up on me, did you?" Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with emotion. "Never, Amelie. I just didn't know how to show it." She nodded, squeezing his hand. "Well, now you're here, and that's what matters." Lucas announced his final song, an original composition he had written specifically for that night. "This song is about new beginnings," he said, "and how people can enter our lives just when we need them the most. It's dedicated to all of you, but especially to Thomas and Amelie." The melody was a perfect blend of melancholy and hope, reflecting the journey of Lucas, Thomas, and Amelie. The lyrics seemed to capture everything they had faced together, and when the last note resonated, the auditorium erupted in applause. Lucas stood, smiling shyly as he thanked the audience. They applauded him on their feet, and Thomas discreetly wiped away tears. After the concert, Lucas found Thomas and Amelie in the hallway of the auditorium. He looked visibly exhausted but radiant. "You were amazing, kid," Thomas said, embracing Lucas tightly. "Thanks," Lucas replied, smiling, "but I'm not done yet." He pulled something from his coat pocket and handed it to Thomas. It was the old watch he had stolen months before, polished and shining like new. "How did you get this?" Thomas asked, surprised. "I used the money from my first gig to buy it back," Lucas explained. "It was the right thing to do." Thomas held the watch, looking at Lucas with a mix of pride and gratitude. "You didn't have to do this, but it means more than you can imagine. Thank you." Amelie watched the scene, emotional. "Lucas, you're not just part of our family now. You're an inspiration to all of us." Lucas smiled, feeling a wave of happiness and belonging like he had never felt before. As they walked out of the auditorium together, Thomas looked at Lucas and Amelie, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: peace. He knew that the path to this moment hadn't been easy, but he finally felt he had found his place. Lucas, for his part, felt reborn. Music had become more than a passion. It was now a purpose. He knew he would still face challenges, but he was no longer alone. In the distance, the lights of the auditorium shone brightly in the night, symbolizing a new chapter in the lives of three people who had found redemption, reconnection, and above all, hope. The journey of Thomas, Lucas, and Amelie reminds us that it's never too late to transform our lives and mend broken relationships. Thomas's courage to face his past, Lucas's determination to overcome his demons, and Amelie's willingness to forgive show us that second chances can lead to extraordinary beginnings. This story is a powerful reminder that human connections, nurtured with empathy and love, can overcome even the deepest mistakes. Now a reflection. How many times have you had the chance to start over, but let fear or pride hold you back? Which part of this story moved you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear what this story meant to you. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, hit the like button, and leave your comment below. Your support is essential for the growth of the channel, and don't stop here. Check out the next recommended video in the final card on the screen. Another moving story is waiting for you. Thank you so much for watching, and see you on the next emotional journey.